Did can they see me?
Yes.
So I can't pick my nose while I'm talking.
I mean, you can. Just then watch.
Would be a good idea. Okay. Let me first, I hope you all got the two books that we sent out in addition to everything else this week. One of them is Eric Hobsbawm's. They're both survey histories of the 20th century, of the period that is concerning us at this period of time, at this point in the course. And one is Eric Hobsbawm's history of the 20th century. Eric Hobsbawm may be one of the greatest historians in the English language in the 20th century. I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. One of. He was a German Jew, comes to England, escaping obviously from the Nazis, and as a child, and is brought up in England. Pretty early on, he joins the Communist Party. Now, I want to make a point of that because it's almost, given the history of historiography about Europe and about all of these matters in America, it is almost surprising that somebody who was an avowed member of the Communist Party would so rise above his party membership and the ideological straitjacket that being a party member, particularly, as we'll see as we talk today, particularly in the period of the 40s and 50s and so forth, to be able to write as wonderfully as he did and as broadly as he did, it is itself a feat. But his book is really worthwhile perusing. And again, let me make that point, that you want to find out what the argument is and get a flavor for it. You don't have to read every word. The other book is especially important, perhaps to me, but nonetheless, I thought I would send it out to you. A similar book by George Lichtheim. And George, who I knew very well, and in fact, was one of my own mentors, was a Marxist Hegelian philosopher, again, moves to England in order to escape the Nazis, and was on the left of what became institutionally the struggle between capitalism and communism for the soul of Europe, and by extension, the soul of the world. And I'll explain what I mean by that at some point. But he was sort of on the left of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, never actually part of it. But he was one of the most fertile thinkers he was a Hegelian primarily, one of the most fertile thinkers in Marxism, socialism. He wrote what was for many years a standard history of socialism. And this book that we sent out, George Lichtheim, is an attempt on his part to write a composite history of the 20th century where the intellectual and the physical, where the institutional, where the cultural and the socioeconomic histories are woven together in such a way that one understands, as one should if one were a proper Hegelian Marxist. So where one understands how history works, what the interaction between these elements are. So I think the book has great value in and of itself, but also it stands as a really very interesting exercise in the kind of history that the people we're talking about were concerned with. Forgive me, you can all see me having a glass of water when I do that, but I can't help it. All right. I'm amazed. I reread the Plague twice this weekend, and each time I started again, I was amazed how au courant it was with the scene where we are these days, right? This business about we're going to open the country again, we're going to do all of these things, And that kept pushing me to the end of the novel, because essentially that's where we are at the end of the novel. The novel is an incredibly, it was serendipitous. I hadn't realized that history would catch up with literature quite the way that we have begun catching up with Camus' novel. But it also occurred to me that today, in the email I get, one of the, I don't know, you call it a blog or a journal, whatever it is, it's called Compass. Comes out of England. It's a progressive English journal. And the headline was, we ain't gonna go back, which struck me very strongly also, because it was the kind of statement that Ryu is going to make at the end of the novel, just beyond the end of the novel. We can't go back. Whatever I've discovered in the course of the novel, he seems to be saying, we're not going back to where we were. And similarly, it's this cry of the social democrats, the democratic socialists, that there's something wrong with the past, and we can't go back to the past. We can't restore the past. Our problem is to find a new way forward. So I want today to, first of all, start out by telling you how I look at this novel, which is not the same way that one would look at it in a humanities course or a French literature course, or in a course like structural liberal education, which would tend to look at it more as a humanities object. I'm looking at it more as an historical object. What is it that it says? What kind of object is this novel? And to get at that question, I need to describe a little bit of the political history within which I would set this novel, as a kind of a jewel on a ring composed of these various other elements that compose the design. And to do that, I want to mention what the condition of Europe was intellectually, morally, when this book was published, when it was being written and published. The book is published in 1947. So that we presume that he wrote it at some time, either towards the end of the war or immediately after the war. And that requires us to at least have a sketch, a bird's eye view of what kind of Europe it was when he publishes this novel, and why therefore it had such an appeal, and why it's so interesting to us. So I thought I would approach that as in this way. First of all, you're going to remember that at the end of the war, there are these camps that we talked about last time. On the one hand, you have the camp of communism. Now, whether we like today to admit it or not, and remember that today we are the products of Cold War historiography. In 1945, in that early period, the Soviet Union, first of all, was seen as, by some, the primary victor against the Nazis. By others, as one of the two great victors against the Nazis, the other being the US. Obviously, which way you valued it depended to some extent on some a priori political assumptions you might yourself make. But what we don't talk about nowadays, we don't talk much about the Second World War anyway, outside of the movies, but the immense human suffering that Russia underwent during the Second World War was a major component of the cultural world at the end of the war. If you went back and did a history of American films during the Second World War, one of the things you would find, there are a lot of movies, Mother Russia, a stupid movie with that about old babushkas and how wonderful they were fighting the Nazis, hiding bombs in their bosoms, things like that. You would find a lot of movies and a lot of novels. A lot of Russian literature was being translated. It was very in to suffer with the Russian people, albeit on Fifth Avenue, to suffer alongside the Russian people in this titanic struggle. Millions upon millions of Russians were killed. And of course, at this point, we haven't yet understood a few people did, but it hadn't become part of popular culture that the Russians had their own concentration camps, and that Stalinism was quickly becoming, had already become to some extent, a heinous dictatorship in its own right. Nonetheless, communism had a very strong appeal. And that appeal rested on the idea that in spite of the Nazi invasion, in spite of fighting the Germans with such difficulty as they had, they came through. There was something powerful, something strong in the will of the people. And it's only at the end of the war, the very end of the war, in fact, when they celebrated the victory in Moscow and Stalin gives his toast, the famous story that he gives a toast to the great Russian people, not to the great Soviet people, to the great Russian people, that even among those intellectuals who are specializing on Eastern Europe, they begin to get a suspicion that maybe it isn't communism, there's something else going on there. But nonetheless, there's that camp, the left, the far left camp of communism. Then, of course, you have fascism. And fascism is, as I said last time, and I will repeat again today, fascism is an intellectually, institutionally viable approach to the organization of society. It may not be morally acceptable from the point of view of many of us, but it is institutionally a workable idea. It does have a certain rationality about it. In fact, one of the points about fascism is that once you get beyond the leadership principle, which is a kind of fantasy we'll come back to, once you get beyond that, you have an attempt to really rationalize society and rationalize the state. The war comes to an end and we think fascism is defeated, but of course that's not true. Fascism isn't defeated. It survives in Spain for a whole series of reasons. It survives in Portugal for a whole series of reasons. Pro-German fascism is replaced by what I would argue, and it was George Lichtheim who pointed this out to me originally. Although I think he got it perhaps from his Trotskyite friends, it is replaced in Eastern Europe by a left-wing fascism, because indeed the way communism had come to organize itself by the end of the Second World War, they had learned an awful lot of lessons from their enemy. So fascism didn't die with the war. In fact, it's very much alive today, as we know. It didn't die in the war. It survived in many parts of the world and became a viable political position in Latin America in many places, Argentina, for example. Then you have, of course, the capitalist West, the other victor in the war. The United States, nobody thinks Britain won the war. People know that Britain suffered, but without the United States, nobody believed in America that Britain could possibly have gotten anywhere. So you have the capitalist system. You have America and liberal capitalism. This liberal capitalism is not the capitalism we understand today. It's the capitalism that came out of the Roosevelt period plus the war. It was a much more organized idea of capitalism than we have today. The New Deal plus the war created what today we would call a social democratic system, in my opinion, which then undergoes decay and defeat by the 1980s. So you have these three groups. And then you have the newly liberated Germans, liberated from their own fascism, French, liberated from their own fascism. We easily forget that France had a very powerful fascist tradition. And that although we like to think about Camus and Sartre and everything they represent, the fact is that under Marshal Pétain, the great military hero from the First World War, France had a fascist government in half of it that the Germans putatively entered into an alliance with. They permitted it to survive. But a very great percentage of the French people paid allegiance to it. And it was with very great difficulty that Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, is able to get a hold on the French imagination in the course of the war itself, mainly fighting from London and arguing over the radio and so forth for an alternative France. So France also had fallen victim to this, as had, say, Norway, for example. You'll see why I mentioned Norway in a moment. Norway also had a native fascist movement, which ends up being led by a man named Quisling, whose name has become a kind of has become a term in the English language for a traitor, or collaborator. But Norway had its own fascist movement. Sweden had its own fascist movement. Fascism was very widespread. The war is over, and within that first few years, especially the first few years, by 47, you'll see why I think that's important. The question was, where do we go from here? It isn't a simple choice, which we would think of. We go to capitalism and American democracy. That wasn't a choice for these people because they well understood, so they thought, that there had been a relationship between American capital, not capitalism, American capital and the Germans, for example. They very well knew about that. Remember that American capital collaborated with the Germans economically through Switzerland during much of the war. It's a history also we don't like to think much about, but it certainly was there. And they're suspicious. They never were real capitalists in the American sense of the word. In a way, what we call capitalism in America was an outlier from the kind of social development that was characteristic of Europe. So they're looking for a place to go. And there are four political leaders who, in my mind, are symbolic of the choice that they make, that Western Europe makes at this point. And they're political leaders. You'll see how I connect them with Cameroon in a moment. First of all, of course, there is Willy Brandt, for example. Now, Willy Brandt becomes much later the Chancellor of Germany, but Willy Brandt becomes the leader of the Socialist Party very quickly after the Second World War. What is significant about Willy Brandt from our story is that he spent the war years in Norway. In order to escape the Nazis, Willy Brandt is born. He's born in what later became East Europe into a very poor family. He had a single mother. She worked very hard. He has a very typical kind of story you would expect. But he spends the war years in Norway, and he comes back to Germany at the end of the war, really imbued, not only from his own experience of being an impoverished child in Germany before the war, but also imbued with the culture and social values and ideas of Norway, which to no small extent fired up Norway to struggle against the Nazis during the Second World War. Another man that I would mention as in part of the same generation, another man is Bruno Kroeske, a name many of you have probably never heard. Bruno Kroeske was the longest lived Chancellor of Austria since the First World War. A nice Jewish boy, leaves the Jewish community very early in his life because it had nothing to say to him. But nonetheless, is a Jew from the Nazi point of view. And when the Nazis take over Austria in 1938, Kroeske escapes to Sweden, and he spends the war years in Sweden. And then he returns to Austria at the end of the war and becomes the leader of the Austrian Socialist Party, and indeed provides Austria with a socialist government stemming from a very old Austro-Marxian, Austro-socialist tradition going all the way back to the First World War. And he becomes quite recognized throughout the world as an important figure, albeit here's little Austria, the tail end of a great empire that no longer existed. Another person that I want to mention is Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee becomes Prime Minister of Britain in 1945. As soon as the war is over, the British hold an election, I think it was in August 1945. They throw out Winston Churchill. We, all of us, being brought up in an Anglo-Saxon historical tradition, think of Churchill, of Churchillian oratory, of the leadership of Churchill. Churchill is quite a different figure historically than we have built him up to be in our own imaginary world. And the British, who knew what Churchill was and knew what class Churchill represented, and don't forget that Britain was a very, very class society, and not happily so. And the British throw out the conservatives in 1945 as soon as the war is over and elect the socialists to power. And Clement Attlee is the first prime minister after the war in Britain, the first socialist prime minister since the Ramsay MacDonald, who served between the wars for a short period of time and eventually betrayed the Socialist Party and joined the Liberals. So Clement Attlee comes from the middle class, well off, grew up to be a lawyer and took a job in a law firm that specialized in what we today would call poverty law. And he spent several years in the slums of London working with poor people, and that radically changed him. And it's that which propelled him into the socialist camp. And the last person I would mention as symbolic of this period is Olof Palme. Olof Palme, a prime minister of Sweden for many years, leader of the Swedish Social Democratic Party, also comes from an aristocratic family in his case. Also, the influence on him that turned him to the left was that he comes to America at the end of the war. He's given a fellowship to go to Kenyon College. And after a year or 2 years, I can't recall now, at Kenyon College, he travels around America. And there was in America in those years, immediately after the Second World War, a very active union movement, a civil right, the beginnings of the civil rights movement. The auto workers, for example, were a very powerful union led by Walter Reuther. Walter Reuther was one of the greatest union leaders in American history. And Palme goes, he wants to experience more of America. So after he travels around and meets workers everywhere, he decides to go to try to go to work for Walter Reuther, ends up writing about him, studying him, and working with Walter Reuther. And throughout his life, Walter Reuther, this great American labor leader, is a stature of some symbolic importance in Olof Palme's history. And he becomes the prime minister of Sweden. So this generation of people is each in their own way, in their own country. And there are many more I could mention. 10 years later, I would cite Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, for example. Nehru, the real political leader and organizer of Indian independence movement, who was an out-and-out socialist, a very active member of the Socialist International. There was a whole generation of leaders in the world who wanted nothing to do with the East. They did not want the communists. They understood that communism was viable, they thought, in that period of time, but they opposed it. And the question is, why did they oppose it, which we'll get to in a moment. Then they didn't want anything really to do with the West. They really did not want to be part of the capitalist West. And it's in that context that they begin to define a post-war social democratic, social political position. So the important things to keep in mind is that these were very creative individuals, but that these are people who are dealing on the ground in a new world in which they have to reassemble the culture. And they have to, in their respective countries, literally, of course, not Sweden, which was neutral and didn't suffer physically, but certainly in Norway and Germany, France, etc. They had to really reassemble the society from the ground up, rebuild the cities, rebuild social organizations, deal with the remnants of fascism, deal with the possibility of communism as always holding out an attractive hand to their fellow countrymen. And out of this comes a very practical, and that's the word I want to emphasize, a very practical approach to the question of what is social democracy or what is democratic socialism. it's incredibly important that you keep in mind this idea of a practical approach. It was not ideological, it was political. I'll explain why I make that distinction in a moment. And that is the atmosphere in which Camus writes this book. Now, that's a very different context to think about it than the history of French literature, or then, quote, existentialism, unquote. Existentialism, which you all know, I'm not going to go into any detail at all about, but existentialism, which is associated mostly with Sartre's name, with whom Camus has this epic falling out that we talked about last time. Existentialism was a response to this dilemma of rebuilding the psyche of Europe. What do you have to hold on to? This is the real question that they're facing. What do you have to hold on to? And the Social Democrats say that all we have to hold on to is the practical work of rebuilding the sensual world. And that's one of the reasons why I keep emphasizing that if socialism has any meaning in our age, it has to take into account, it has to be rooted deeply in the sensuality of the world itself. That is to say, that part of Marxist thought, which says that man is homo faber, man the maker, man the producer, man who takes a piece of wood and converts it into a table, or digs up some iron from the ground and eventually produces an aeroplane, or whatever you do with iron, the axe. That this idea that man engages the world sensually, that's what I believe was at the core of this generation of social democrats that I mentioned. And it is also then, and I'm kind of make my argument quickly because of time, it is also then in that generation that the failure of the left today is rooted. And that's why what this novel is really all about. In a very interesting way, this novel is a signpost pointing toward what has become the failure of the left and raising the issues of what direction the left needs to move in. Let me try and say what I mean. If you look at the history of the left before the First World War, in the period, taking a long, very long view of history between the French Revolution and the First World War, it is deeply rooted in what I would call a metaphysics of rationality, a metaphysics of reason. The deepest, perhaps most profound intellectual, metaphysical, meta-intellectual, whatever word you want to use, I'm sure we can cook up somewhere, change that takes place in the context of the French Revolution is the collapse, and we talked about this before, is the collapse of the deocentric, God-centric view of the universe. And in place of God-centrism, in place of the idea that everything stems from God, everything from property to what I think and believe. Why am I a sinner? Because God challenges me to do X, right? In place of that, the French Revolution, what? I hear somebody say something. In place of that, the French Revolution puts reason. The idea that all there is, the only way, there is no God, or whether there's a God or not is almost irrelevant. What there is reason, human reason. Now, one may say that, for example, our contemporary idea of creationism, in which we look at the universe around us, I look at the shelves here in my kitchen, and they're all regular, and they're all fit, and they all work. That's because God is a reasonable, whatever God is. God is reasonable, and God creates patterns in our minds which convert the universe into a reasonable place in which we see that the parts of the puzzle fit together our job as human beings is to figure out the logic that God has given us implicitly in our minds by creating the universe. That, in a way, was the way Hegel thought. Hegel is a prototypical figure of that era. One of Hegel's most important works is The Great Logic. He's trying to understand what is this reason that God has endowed us with. And as Hegel himself moves to the right politically, moves in the direction of the Prussian state politically, and he writes the Phenomenology of Mind, which is all about how reason comes into itself. Reason becomes fully conscious of itself, and at that point achieves its ultimate objective. It fulfills God's plan for it. The other side of that same coin, the other side of the coin of reason, is to say there's no such thing as God anyway, but reason exists as a human characteristic. Pure and simple. We don't need God to say that it's part of the human beings, again, to use this terminology. Part of the species being of human beings is reason. And this was very much a part of the French Revolution. They really did believe that that was the case. And they established what was called the Institute. The Institute, it becomes the Institute of the French, it becomes eventually the French Academy. The idea of the Institute was to study ideas. The word ideology, the study of ideas, comes out of the French Revolution. And what they want to say is that ideas are produced by men. We understand that all that exists is reason is part of the human species nature, and there is real concrete reality out there. Ideas are produced by men in reality. You don't have God, there's no God, there's nothing else, but we do produce ideas, and we can study those ideas. This is not to say that we can study the history of ideas. That's a different subject. This is to say that ideas are a human product like any other product, and we can study it and analyze it and understand how ideas work, and therefore use ideas to improve the condition of mankind. Always there's this idea of improving the condition of humankind. So the idea that we have of ideology, and Marx buys into this completely in his younger years, the idea of ideology is the production of ideas and the assumption that that production leads to that reason, the mechanism through which we produce ideas. We apply reason to the phenomena of reality, and out of that make a story, make a universe. And we can then also, using reason, improve that universe. That's the basis that Marx then, when he finally begins to intellectually mature, if you want to use that expression, in the mid-1840s, applies that idea to history. He is looking for reason in history. So what is Marx's adventure, if you will, at that stage in his life, is to take this Hegelian idea of reason coming into itself and saying, well, there's no God. It's all a product of human beings. But I can use that idea. I believe in reason, and I can use reason to explore the dynamics of history itself. And that will explain history and give me, and this is that other side of Marx I mentioned before, give me the tools with which to use history to improve the lot of mankind. By the end of the 19th century, that idea, that faith in a system of thought had begun to unravel. Everybody points out, and there's no question that it's true, that Marx himself had changed his ideas. But also, more important than that, other forms of thinking about how to improve the lot of humankind had begun to develop. alongside but not connected with Marxism. The most particular one, of course, being Fabian, what we now call Fabian Socialism in Britain. The socialism in Britain that rose out of the British labor movement, the Chartist movement that rose out of the intellectuals who were the romantic intellectuals who were disgusted with the product of capitalism, with the way capitalism demeaned human life. I mean, if we were living in the 19th century with any sensibility, wandering around Britain, we would be pretty disgusted with what Manchester was like and so forth. It was pretty grim. They know that Marxism, a lot of Marxism is not working, but nonetheless they have, and in the British case, this is very important, as I believe is also the case in Scandinavia, they have a different source of motivation, and that's Christian values. The nonconformist churches in Britain are extremely important in the emergence of Christian socialism, what eventually will become Fabian socialism. In Scandinavia, the values of Lutheran Christianity, secularized, Scandinavia is one of the least religious parts of the world, but secularized, but the values remain, becomes a source for a non-Marxist socialism. And if you look at the history of these countries in the interwar period, you can see that the labor movement, the socialist movement, non-Marxist very often, begins to develop its own being, its own institutionalization, begins to acquire power, right? And is independent of the Marxian tradition. This is really very important. I can't urge on you enough, if you haven't watched it already, watch the series, I think it's on Netflix, called Babylon Berlin, which is a detective story. It's a wonderful detective story. But it portrays Germany in the period from about 1929 to 1933. And the three forces, or the various political forces, all clustering around these detectives and they're trying to solve crimes, gives you a sense of how different the communists, the social democrats who come not from a Marxist, but a non-Marxist background, the social democrats, the capitalists in Germany, the militarists, a different group, how they all interacted and fought with each other. And looking at this through this mystery story brings it to life in an extremely vivid way. These competing groups all, as I said, come a cropper as a result of the Second World War. By the end of the Second World War, everybody is consumed in the victory, in achieving victory and in the victory against fascism. Mostly in Europe, they've attached the fascist label to Japan, so then eventually in the Pacific also, but the ideological struggle is primarily in Europe. At this point, the war is over, this question of where do you go from here? What do we have available to hold on to? How can we justify political action? The idea of reason coming out of the French Revolution, expanded through Marxism, as a way of grasping history, of seeing history as through the eyes of reason, has gotten us nowhere. It may have told us something about capitalism, but it hasn't given us any point of departure for proceeding into the future. How do we build a new world based upon ideas which have only partially been validated, and which the very grotesqueness, I don't know what word I can find, the very grotesqueness of the Second World War flies in the face of the idea of reason as a way of dealing with the universe. Similarly with religion, there were in the period between the wars, even before the war, the First World War, there were glimmers of socialism in the Catholic Church and in Protestant churches in Central and Northern Europe. But Christianity has come a cropper. How could there be, mind you, I'm asking you to put yourself back in 1945, 46. How could a God exist who would allow what happened to happen? People are absolutely overwhelmed by the Holocaust and by the camps. Not just the Jews, the non-Jews are also overwhelmed by them in the sense that they can't understand how human culture could have produced something so grotesque. Germany, the most advanced, intellectual, enlightened country of Europe, has looked into the abyss and fallen deeply into it. So although there are here and there individuals, one thinks of Simone Weil, one thinks of the Archbishop of Paris, there are individuals here and there in the church who are trying to find a way out. By and large, religion is not an answer. And you can't build a political system any longer based upon religious values. So where are you going to turn? And this is what Camus is writing about, in my opinion. That this novel is trying to say, and here is the political importance of it, but also the metaphysical distinction between him and Camus and Sartre. Camus is trying to say, there is nothing on which I can fall back to justify the politics I know I have to pursue. Because that's his problem. He wants to reconstruct the world. He wants to live a human and humane life in a world that doesn't seem to allow it. What do you fall back on? So the structure of the novel gives us that. He describes Oran at the beginning of the novel. Those of you who have read it will now, I hope, remember this. It's the most flat place you can possibly imagine. Each time I reread those first pages, I was struck by the lack of color. Here, it's a very simplified society, right? There are walls, there are streets. The people are very uninteresting. All they're really interested in is their immediate pleasures, and they're interested in doing business. That's all they're interested in. And what he's done there is to describe the world reduced to almost the point of being zero. He doesn't go all the way to zero. He doesn't say the world doesn't exist, but he reduces the world to a couple of very simple things: business and getting pleasure. And remember, there's a line in the beginning there. I can't look it up right now, but there's a line about love that they would fall in love, because that's the thing you did it. Love was very important as part of the business of the world, but they didn't know they were falling in love. Love as a profound passion also didn't seem to exist. And having created this universe, this image of the world at nearly point zero, he then introduces the plague, this totally unexpected, unprepared for, it echoes for us today, factor which is going to turn up everything, call everything into question. And if you look at the various characters, Ryu himself, the doctor, he's pretty much concerned, he's a doctor. Why is he a doctor? Of course, given the fact that Camus is using the play, you have to have that character as a doctor. But I think there's another reason why. If you look at the literature that comes out in the 20s and 30s, you look at Malraux's writings and so forth, his novels, you often will find that a doctor is the key figure, because doctors were analysts, right? Doctors were those who applied reason and knowledge to understanding how the human body worked. Well, if I can apply reason and understanding to how the human body worked, I can do the same thing, perhaps, with politics, with the body politic, or with history and so forth. Doctors, historically, in fact, it's interesting. Think of Sun Yat-sen in China. Doctors often played revolutionary roles because they were analysts par excellence. They could analyze the disease of society. And since they were trained to find medicine to heal society, they also could use that medical analogy to arrive at social programs that might heal the political body, much as they would find in some chemical potion to heal the physical body. So Ryu almost has to be a doctor. Whether Camus thought this way or not, he had to have Ryu as a doctor. And then all the other characters become identifiable and interesting only by virtue of their reactions to the plague. The one who stands out, for example, the priest, very self-interested. And of course, in the end, he himself dies of the plague. He is emblematic of the failure of religion at that particular moment. That is not to say, and I don't want anyone to think I'm saying this, that there were not church heroes in the struggle against fascism. There were. But the church as an institution did not fight against fascism. The culture of the church did not fight against fascism. This is also very much a part of the ethos of the novel. The fact that the priest in the novel is very self-interested and only wants to promote his own interests, the interests of his own institution, is not concerned with human welfare, is very much emblematic of how people in those days were reading the church's experience and behavior during the Second World War. At the end of the novel, what have they got left? They have successfully fought the plague. A few of these characters, a couple of them undergo conversion. Conversion meaning conversion to what will eventually be Ryu's only hope. But the entire story is told out in the fate of each individual character. At the very end, if you go back and read the last 2 or 3 pages again, when Ryu is thinking now about this experience, the plague is over, but he's a very smart man. He knows very well that the plague will come back again. Again, listen to the echoes of Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx with an X. There's no solution. The plague is going to come back again. Things are quiet now. What has Ryu discovered? Ryu has discovered there is no metaphysical structure on which he can hang a solution to the problem posed by the disintegration of society in the face of the plague and the necessity to heal the body politic. The only thing he can find is a sense of solidarity with those who feel the same way he does. That's all. That, to me, is what makes this novel quintessentially significant for the story of social democracy and democratic socialism in our age. One of the things that I would argue, I am arguing, that's why I'm doing this. One of the things I would argue is that the left has lost, now I'll explain what I mean in a moment. The left has lost the metaphysical structure on the basis of which to validate its policies, its ideas, its attitudes, its emotions. Reason is no longer there. The left cannot rely on reason anymore. Reason is very weak in its opposition to the powers of fascism, as we're witnessing in the United States right now. God is dead from the point of view of the body politic. There are very few people these days who will argue, although many of us might wish that the Pope were the emperor of the world, the truth of the present Pope, not any Pope, the present Pope. But there are very few people who would argue for a return to a religious state, for a kind of feudal religious state. There are those historians who used to argue that, but not today. The loss of a metaphysical foundation upon which to hang the policies that will lead to the amelioration of the human condition is the great weakness of social democracy. Now, it is that weakness that caused eventually the break between, in my reading of it at this moment, between Camus and Sartre. Sartre, faced with the same issue, of course, maybe Sartre even understood the issue a little bit earlier. Sartre in this period turns gradually, and this is a very contentious statement, to communism, or at least to the support of the Soviet Union and Stalinism as a way of resolving this question. If Sartre also, like Camus and Sartre does, exists in a universe that is not going to help, there is nothing in the universe out there which is going to help you. The universe is absurd. It's death. Look up the original meaning of the word absurd. It means death. The universe does not hear our cries. Sartre, nonetheless, needs a point on which to justify his ideas, justify amelioration of the human condition. And he finds in Stalinism, in that act of control that Stalinism represents, the ultimate act of control that Stalinism represents, the only response to the absurdity of the universe. But when Camus in 47 is thinking about this realm, he can't find that as an answer, because that answer of this ultimate act of control, of assertion that Stalinism represents philosophically, that act is itself a fascist act from the point of view of Camus. And you cannot justify the reconstruction of the world in terms of the world that you have just worked to destroy. Very important that Camus was active in the resistance, by the way. So I think that this novel both summarizes the dilemma that we are still facing in the West today. It almost surgically, given the fact that Ryu is a doctor, it almost surgically shows us why we have this dilemma, that there's nothing we have to hold on to. And it only finds a suggestion of a possibility of hope in human solidarity. In that, there's no other word for it, a sense of human solidarity is all that we have in the face of the universe as it really is. We look at Trump and we talk about Trump's divisiveness, but that's exactly the point. What Ryu wants is a politics of solidarity. If Camus were alive today, he would be arguing against Trump's policy of divisiveness for that reason. There is nothing else. That's, to me, is the dilemma that we have to talk about in the rest of this course, is what are the answers that are available? What are the attempts that we need to make to construct a metaphysical justification for what is obviously for some of us a necessary position, namely that human society must be improved. I'm finished for the moment.